Greetings, everyone. This is Grandma, and I'm about to begin a new book, and it's actually a very old book. And the one that I am reading is the 100th Anniversary Collection. And that means that they have reproduced it to have the font and the pictures are the same that were in the original edition 100 years ago. Because this is a book that is so old, some of the vocabulary in it is a little bit dated and difficult to understand. So we're going to go a little bit slower through this book than we have through some of the others. But we will begin with what I always begin with, which is previewing the book. Previewing the book helps get your brain adjusted as to what's going on. And it just makes it easier to understand and easier to remember if you were to have to take a test on it. It's a lot like stretching or warming up in athletics. You're doing the same thing to your brain. You're getting it warmed up so that it can perform. First of all, I want you to look at the cover. And that kind of tells us something. What does it tell us? That it's going to be a story about dogs, and it looks like sled dogs. The name of the book is The Call of the Wild by Jack London. So we know it's going to be about dogs. We know that it's probably going to be in an area similar to Alaska or Canada that has sled dogs. Okay. When we open this up, we will see two things. One is this page, which is really hard to figure out what it is until you read the bottom, which says, "And beyond that fire, Buck could see many gleaming coals, 2 by 2, always 2 by 2. Well, that means it's eyes that are looking at him, and it's a lot of eyes that are looking at him. We also get the idea that maybe Buck is the main character in the story. Then we look at this page and we see what appears to be a Saint Bernard. So Saint Bernard is going to be very important in our story. Also, when we preview a book, we kind of flip through it. And I already did that and showed you the fonts and showed you some of the photographs that there is. Like here's one that says Francois. And we see that my guess was right, that it is going to take place in a place that is icy and cold with dog sleds. All right. Then we flip to the end, and I always like to look at the end of the book because sometimes there's a glossary, sometimes there's maps, sometimes there's information to give you about the characters, but in this case, it just says fini, which is the end, and we have another picture of dog sled. So I look to the back cover, and I see that the back cover has some interesting things about The Call of the Wild. The Call of the Wild is Jack London's best-known book. It follows Buck, a huge Saint Bernard. And we already got those ideas from the first few pages, that it was going to be about somebody named Buck and it would involve a Saint Bernard. As he is kidnapped from his comfortable life in California and transported to the Klondike Gold Rush. His abductors sell him to be used as a sled dog for the miners in the North. He slowly discovers his ancient roots as his civilized upbringing is slowly eroded by the harsh realities of life on the trail. London drew upon his experience in the Yukon to produce a realistic adventure. And then if you're interested, there's some information here about Jack London. But we found out that Jack London wrote this book based on his own experiences in the Yukon. So we're going to start with chapter 1, Into the Primitive. And we have a picture over here, and it involves a word that I had never seen before. Over this great domain. And I had to look it up. And domain is like an estate or a plantation. It's acreage that's attached to a house. Okay, so we're going to begin Into the Primitive, chapter 1. And this is a quote, underneath the chapter heading. Old longings, nomadic leap, chafing at custom's chain, again from its broom-old sleep, wakens the ferine strain. Now I'm going to begin the chapter. Buck did not read the newspapers, or he would have known that trouble was brewing. Not alone for himself, but for every tidewater dog, strong of muscle and with warm, long hair from Puget Sound to San Diego, because men, groping in the Arctic darkness, had found a yellow metal, and because steamship and transportation companies were booming this find, thousands of men were rushing into the Northlands. These men wanted dogs, and the dogs they wanted were heavy dogs with strong muscles by which to toil and furry coats to protect them from the frost. So many of our guesses were correct. It is going to have to do with being a sled dog, and it is because gold has been discovered in the Yukon area. And they need the dogs to help them with transportation and to provide warmth, actually. Okay, Buck lived at a big house in the sun-kissed Santa Clara Valley, Judge Miller's place, it was called. It stood back from the road, half hidden among the trees, through which glimpses could be caught of the wide, cool veranda that ran across its four sides. Try to make a movie in your head as I'm describing this. You start out with a kind of a blank slate, and as I add details, add to this movie or this picture that you make in your head. So first of all, we have a picture. It takes place in California, and it is a sun-kissed, so the sun's shining. It involves an estate that stands back from the road, half hidden among trees, with a cool veranda, which is like a porch, that runs along four sides. The house was approached by gravel driveways which wound about through the wide-spreading lawns and under the interlacing boughs of tall poplars. At the rear, things were on even a more spacious scale than at the front. There were great stables where a dozen grooms and boys held forth, rows of vine-clad servants' cottages, an endless and orderly array of outhouses, long grape arbors, green pastures, orchards, and berry patches. Then there was the pumping plant for the artesian well, and the big cement tank where Judge Miller's boys took their morning plunge and kept cool in the hot afternoon. So we have a picture here of something that's warm, green, beautiful, attractive, and it is probably owned by someone very wealthy. And over this great domain, and that's a word that I introduced you to earlier, Buck ruled. Now we know Buck is a dog, and I've had households where the dog ruled also. Here he was born, and here he had lived the 4 years of his life. It was true, there were other dogs. There could not but be other dogs on so vast a place, but they did not count. They came and went, resided in the populous kennels, or lived obscurely in the recesses of the house after the fashion of Toots, the Japanese pug, or Isabel, the Mexican hairless, a Chihuahua. Strange creatures that rarely put nose out of doors or set foot on the ground. On the other hand, there were the fox terriers, a score of them at least, who yelped fearful promises at Toots and Isabel looking out the windows at them, and protected by a legion of housemaids armed with brooms and mops. But Buck was neither a house dog nor kennel dog. The whole realm was his, like a kingdom. He plunged into the swimming tank, or went hunting with the judge's sons. He escorted Molly and Alice, the judge's daughters, on long twilight or early morning rambles. On wintry nights, he lay at the judge's feet before the roaring library fire. He carried the judge's grandsons on his back, or rolled them in the grass and guarded their footsteps through wild adventures down to the fountain in the stable yard, and even beyond, where the paddocks were and the berry patches. Among the terriers, he stalked imperiously, and Toots and Isabel he utterly ignored. For he was king. King over all creeping, crawling, flying things of Judge Miller's place, humans included. His father, Elmo, a huge St. Bernard, had been the judge's inseparable companion, and Buck bid fair to follow in the way of his father. He was not so large, for his mother, Shep, had been a Scotch shepherd dog. Nevertheless, 140 pounds, to which was added the dignity that comes of good living and universal respect, enabled him to carry himself in right royal fashion. During the 4 years since his puppyhood, he had lived the life of a sated aristocrat. That's a well-fed aristocrat. He had a fine pride in himself, was even a trifle egotistical, as country gentlemen sometimes become because of their insular situation, but he had saved himself by not becoming a mere pampered house dog. Hunting and kindred outdoor delights, and to him, as the cold tubbing races, the love of water had been a tonic and a health preserver. Now, I had no idea what cold tubbing races were, so I looked it up, and there's a lot of people who are confused as to what it is. But I think the idea was earlier in the chapter when it said there was a pumping station for the artesian well and the big cement tank where Judge Miller's boys took their morning plunge. That there is a big tank, perhaps for swimming, perhaps for cooling off, and Buck enjoys going in there just like the human adults do. That it is a tonic and preserves his health. And this was the manner of dog Buck was in the fall of 1897, when the Klondike strike dragged men from all over the world into the frozen north. But Buck did not read the newspapers, and he did not know that Manuel, one of the gardener's helpers, was an undesirable acquaintance. Manuel had one besetting sin. He loved to play Chinese lottery. Also, in his gambling, he had one besetting weakness: faith in a system. And this made his damnation certain. For to play a system requires money, while the wages of a gardener's helper do not lap over the needs of a wife and numerous progeny. The judge was at a meeting of the Raisin Growers Association, and the boys were busy organizing an athletic club. On the memorable night of Manuel's treachery, no one saw him and Buck go off through the orchard on what Buck imagined was merely a stroll. And with the exception of a solitary man, no one saw them arrive at the little flag station known as College Park. Now, a flag station is not exactly a train station, but it is a place where if you flag down the train will stop or pause. Sometimes they have these also at places where they simply need water. It's not a station where people get on and off, but rather it is a place where it pauses. The train slows down and pauses for a bit. The man talked with Manuel, and money chinked between them. So Manuel went to the man that was at the college station and said something, and money exchanged hands. "You might wrap up the goods before you deliver 'em," the stranger said gruffly, and Manuel doubled a piece of stout rope over Buck's neck under the collar. "Twist it and you'll choke 'em plenty," said Manuel, and the stranger grunted a ready affirmative. Buck had accepted the rope with quiet dignity. To be sure, it was an unwanted performance, but he had learned to trust in men he knew, and to give them credit for a wisdom that outreached his own. But when the ends of the rope were placed in the stranger's hands, he growled menacingly. He had merely intimated his displeasure in his pride, believing that to intimate was to command. But to his surprise, the rope tightened around his neck, shutting off his breath. In quick rage, he sprang at the man, who met him halfway, grappled him close by the throat, and with a deft twist, threw him over his back. Then the rope tightened mercilessly, while Buck struggled in a fury, his tongue lolling out of his mouth, and his great chest panting futilely. Never in all his life had he been treated so vilely, and never in all his life had he been so angry. But his strength ebbed, his eyes glazed, and he knew nothing when the train was flagged, and the two men threw him into the baggage car. Well, we're going to pause here. So, Buck has been growing up in California, living a good life, being well respected. He has never wanted for food. He really has made no friends among the other dogs. He considers himself above them. But sadly, he is a kind of dog that is much needed in the Yukon. And Manuel needs money. So Manuel has basically sold the dog to the man at the train station who has thrown him on a baggage cart. We're going to pause. We're going to stop here. And I'm going to tell you why. My internet and computer, I can't have it too long or it doesn't upload very well. So I have to stop now. I have to stop right between 15 and 20 minutes for most of these readings for that reason. I'm happy that you were here, and I think you're going to really enjoy this book. It's been very popular for over 100 years. Bye-bye.